The Romans destroyed them. The Romantic poets reinvented them. And for 2,000 years, everyone who came after just kept passing the myth forward without ever stopping to ask the most important question of all. Who were the Druids, actually? Not according to the men who conquered them, not according to the poets who romanticized them centuries later, but according to the ground itself, according to the bones, according to the DNA. Because in January 2025, a bombshell paper published in the journal Nature did something no classical scholar, no Romantic poet, and no modern revival movement ever managed to do. It let the dead speak for themselves. And what they said about the world the Druids inhabited, about who held power, who was buried with treasure, who sat at the center of Celtic society, completely rewrites the story, not adjusts it, rewrites it from the beginning. The image we carry of the Druids is one of the most vivid in all of Western mythology. White-robed priests standing in moonlit groves, a golden sickle catching the light as mistletoe is cut from a sacred oak. 20 years of secret initiation, wisdom passed in whispers from master to student across a tradition so old no one could name its beginning. It is a powerful picture. It has survived 2,000 years of retelling, and it is almost entirely built on sand. Here is what the sources actually are. Everything we think we know about the Druids comes from a handful of Greek and Roman writers: Julius Caesar, Pliny the Elder, Strabo, Tacitus, Diodorus Siculus, a small collection of authors writing across roughly 4 centuries, none of whom were Druids themselves, and most of whom had very clear political reasons for describing the peoples of Gaul and Britain in particular ways. If you gathered every ancient reference to the Druids and printed them, you would fill perhaps a dozen pages. And those pages contradict each other constantly. Caesar describes a unified Druidic organization spanning all of Gaul, led by a single elected leader, meeting annually in a sacred grove to settle legal disputes. Strabo and Diodorus divide the priestly class into 3 separate groups with no mention of Caesar's centralized structure. Pliny introduces the golden sickle, the white robes, and the mistletoe ceremony, details found nowhere else in any other account. Tacitus places Druids on the shores of Anglesey screaming curses at Roman soldiers, then drops them completely from his account of the same island's second conquest just a few years later. These are not minor inconsistencies. They cut to the heart of what the Druids were, how they were organized, what they actually believed. Caesar was a military commander writing for a Roman audience, justifying a brutal conquest of Gaul that killed or enslaved roughly 1/3 of its population. Portraying the Gauls as semi-civilized, with an organized priesthood and a recognizable social structure, served his political story. Portraying them as practitioners of human sacrifice and wicker men served it just as well. Both images could be deployed depending on what argument he was making at the time. Modern scholars, including Ronald Hutton and Stuart Piggott, have spent entire careers untangling how much of the classical Druid portrait is genuine observation and how much is political construction. Their honest conclusion is that we genuinely cannot be certain, and that uncertainty is exactly where ancient DNA steps in and changes everything. Before we can place the Druids into their real genetic context, we have to understand the population they emerged from. Because the Celtic peoples of Iron Age Europe were not an ancient, unchanging, pure stock who had always lived in the sacred groves of Gaul and Britain. They were the product of migrations so dramatic, so complete, that the genetic map of Europe had been rewritten multiple times before a single Druid allegedly ever stood in a sacred space. It begins roughly 12,000 years ago. As the last ice age ended and the first hunter-gatherers moved into Western Europe, these were the original inhabitants of the lands that would eventually become Celtic territory. Dark-haired, dark-eyed, genetically unlike any large modern European population. They followed game across a newly thawed landscape and left behind almost nothing but bones and DNA. Then around 6,000 years ago, everything shifted. Neolithic farmers expanding out of what is now Turkey moved into Europe in a wave that transformed the continent. They brought agriculture, domesticated animals, pottery, and a completely different way of life. Their genetic impact was enormous. In Britain and Gaul alike, the incoming farming communities largely absorbed or displaced the older hunter-gatherer population. The great megalithic monuments of this era, Stonehenge in its earliest phases, the passage tombs of Ireland, the long barrows of Britain, were their work, not the Druids, a people who preceded the Druids by thousands of years. And then came the event that defined the genetic foundation of Celtic Europe more than anything else. Around 4,500 years ago, a people associated with what archaeologists call the Bell Beaker culture began moving into Britain and Western Europe from the continent, ultimately tracing their ancestry to the steppes of what is now Ukraine and southern Russia. The scale of what followed is genuinely staggering. Genetic studies suggest that in Britain, these incoming migrants replaced up to 90% of the existing population's ancestry within just a few generations. Not slowly, not gradually, in a span of time that, across the enormous stretch of prehistory, is almost nothing. The people who would eventually give rise to Iron Age Celtic culture, the people from whose world the Druids emerged, were themselves the descendants of one of the most complete population replacements in European prehistory. That foundation matters for everything that follows. Here is where it becomes more complicated and considerably more interesting. Because the spread of Celtic culture across Iron Age Europe did not work the way most people assume. By the time the first Greek and Roman authors were writing about the Celts, Celtic languages and material culture had spread across an enormous arc of Europe, from the Iberian Peninsula in the west to Anatolia in the east. That is an extraordinary cultural reach. But ancient DNA research has revealed something that initially surprised researchers. This expansion was not mainly driven by mass migration. The Bell Beaker replacement had been a genuine demographic event, populations physically moving and displacing existing inhabitants. The Celtic cultural expansion appears to have worked differently. People adopted Celtic languages, burial customs, metalwork traditions, and social structures without being replaced at the genetic level. Culture spread. Genetics stayed. This matters enormously for understanding the Druids. It means the Iron Age peoples of Gaul and Britain were not a genetically uniform bloc. They were a patchwork, populations with different ancestral compositions, different regional histories, different degrees of steppe ancestry inherited from those earlier migrations, now sharing a broadly common cultural framework. Celtic identity in the Iron Age was overwhelmingly a cultural construction rather than a biological one. A shared set of practices and languages worn by peoples of genuinely different ancestry, which raises a question the classical sources never thought to ask. If the Celts were not one people genetically, what exactly were the Druids presiding over? In January 2025, a team of geneticists, led by Dr. Laura Cassidy of Trinity College Dublin, published the results of a study in the journal Nature that changed how we understand Iron Age Celtic society at its foundations. The researchers had sequenced DNA from 57 ancient individuals recovered from burial sites in Dorset, in southern England, belonging to a tribe the Romans called the Durotriges. These burials dated from roughly 100 years before the Roman conquest through the Roman period itself, giving researchers a rare window into what Celtic society actually looked like on the ground rather than in Roman propaganda. What they found was described by one of the researchers as jaw-dropping. It had never been seen before in European prehistory. The community was structured around bonds of female descent. The DNA showed that this was a matrilocal society, meaning that women stayed in their home communities when they married while men moved in from outside. In a cemetery that had been used for generations, the individuals were connected through maternal lines. The richest, most elaborately furnished graves consistently belonged to women, not as exceptions, as the pattern. One dominant female lineage in a Yorkshire Iron Age cemetery, identified in the same broader study, had been established before the year 400 BC. Professor Dan Bradley, co-author of the study, said the team was genuinely surprised by what they found, calling it a widespread phenomenon with deep roots across the island. Dr. Martin Smith of Bournemouth University, one of the archaeologists involved in the Dorset excavations, noted that the wealthiest burials at the site they nicknamed Duropolis always seemed to belong to women. Among the most striking finds were rare Iron Age mirrors. Professor Melanie Giles of the University of Manchester, who has studied these objects, describes them not as vanity items, but as potent objects associated with the spirit world and with a kind of authority that appears to have been specifically female in this culture. One young woman was buried with a chariot amulet showing a victorious female driver. These are not the burials of people who sat quietly at the edges of power. The Romans, when they arrived in Britain, recorded their astonishment at finding women in positions of authority. They wrote about it because they found it so alien to their own world. Modern historians had often assumed those accounts were exaggerated, designed to paint the Britons as uncivilized by Roman standards. The ancient DNA now suggests the Romans were not exaggerating. They were accurately describing a society organized around female power in ways that had deep genetic and cultural roots going back centuries before any Roman soldier ever set foot on British soil. And here is where this collides directly with the Druid question. The classical sources describe the Druids almost entirely as a male institution. Male priests, male philosophers, male judges. And yet Tacitus himself, describing the Roman assault on Anglesey in 60 AD, places black-clad women directly alongside the Druids on the shoreline, torch-bearing and screaming, moving through the British lines in a way that froze the Roman soldiers in their tracks. He describes them as a psychological weapon. They are not described as bystanders or victims. They are described as active ritual participants standing alongside the recognized priestly class. Strabo describes a group of women devoted to a deity on an island sanctuary at the mouth of the Loire, conducting their own independent rituals. No men were permitted. Pomponius Mela describes 9 perpetual priestesses on an island between Gaul and Britain, serving as powerful oracles with the ability to heal the sick and foretell the future. These accounts come from writers whose motives we have every reason to scrutinize, but they appear consistently enough across different writers and different periods to deserve serious weight. What the 2025 DNA research from Dorset adds to this is something extraordinary. It confirms that the highest status individuals in Iron Age Celtic society, the people at the center of the community's wealth, kinship, and most likely its ritual life, were women. The Druids of the Roman imagination were male almost entirely by default, shaped by the assumptions of a society that found female power exotic and threatening. The genetic and archaeological reality underneath that imagination was considerably more complex. The 2025 Nature paper also found something else that reframes the Druid story from a different direction. The research identified what the authors called a footprint of Iron Age migration into coastal southern England from the continent, one that had gone undetected in previous genetic studies. Dr. Cassidy noted that Celtic languages may have been introduced to Britain on more than one occasion, through both the earlier Bronze Age movements and through continued cross-channel mobility during the Iron Age itself. The genetic clusters identified in Iron Age Britain form fine-grained geographical groups, with the peripheral regions, including Scotland, Cornwall, Wales, and northern England, showing signatures of deeper insularity and continuity, while the southern coastal regions show more evidence of continental contact and exchange. This regional complexity matters enormously for the Druid question because it confirms that whoever the Druids were, they operated not across a unified people, but across a patchwork of related but genetically distinct communities, each with its own history, its own depth of steppe ancestry, its own particular connection to the layers of migration that had shaped the island before them. Go back further, and the roots of what the Druids knew become even more interesting. The comparative mythology work of researchers, including Martin West and the late Calvert Watkins, traced threads of Indo-European religious thought, ideas about the sacred nature of fire and water, about the structure of the cosmos, about the transmission of knowledge through memory and oral tradition, from the steppe world all the way into the Celtic and Germanic traditions of Western Europe. These were not independent inventions that happened to look similar. They were inherited, part of a common intellectual tradition that moved west with the people who carried steppe ancestry into Europe during the Bell Beaker period. The knowledge systems attributed to the Druids, the 20 years of oral memorization, the sophisticated astronomical calculations, the legal and philosophical frameworks that Caesar and others describe with grudging admiration, did not appear from nowhere in the forests of Gaul and Britain. They were the westernmost flowering of a tradition whose roots stretched back to the steppes of what is now Ukraine and Russia, carried forward through thousands of years of inheritance and adaptation by the ancestors of the Iron Age Celts. The Coligny calendar, a fragmented bronze tablet found in eastern France and dating from the 1st or 2nd century AD, appears to preserve a complex Celtic lunar solar calendar, tracking time by nights rather than days, exactly as Caesar described Druidic practice. The knowledge required to construct that calendar, to reconcile lunar and solar cycles with agricultural and ritual needs across a multi-year system, did not spring up overnight. It reflects centuries of careful observation, built on older foundations that the Druids inherited rather than invented. Now look at what happens to all of this when the Romans arrive and then leave. The Roman suppression of organized Druidic practice was real. Tiberius and Claudius moved against it. The destruction of the Anglesey sanctuaries described by Tacitus almost certainly reflects genuine Roman policy, an effort to eliminate focal points of native resistance by removing their priestly class. Organized, public Druidic practice in the core Roman provinces was likely suppressed within a generation or two of conquest. The populations of Gaul and Britain did not disappear under Roman rule. They were administered, taxed, partially assimilated, but they remained, and their genetics remained. The regional genetic signatures identified by ancient DNA researchers in Iron Age populations, the Atlantic fringe continuity, the elevated steppe ancestry in Western Ireland and Highland Scotland and coastal Brittany, the distinct clusters that the 2025 Nature study mapped in extraordinary detail, all of these survive in measurable form in modern populations today. The further west and north you go, into the Irish interior, into Highland Scotland, into the Breton Peninsula on the French coast, the lighter the Roman footprint, and the longer the survival of pre-Roman cultural forms. Studies of ancient Irish DNA have identified remarkable genetic continuity between Bronze Age Irish individuals and modern Western Irish population clusters. This is a population that was never conquered by Rome, never subjected to organized imperial suppression of its religious and cultural traditions, and retained a Celtic language continuously from the Iron Age to the present. It is precisely in this population that the Irish mythological cycles, texts featuring Druids as central figures, advisors and seers to pre-Christian kings, were preserved and eventually written down in the early medieval period. In Brittany, genetic studies have identified a population simultaneously distinct from both modern French and modern British populations, preserving a signal of Atlantic Celtic ancestry that reflects the peninsula's history as a refuge for Celtic-speaking communities, including possibly migrants from Britain in the post-Roman period. Brittany was among the last places in continental Europe where a Celtic language survived, and its genetic distinctiveness maps almost exactly onto that cultural resilience. The 4th century Roman poet Ausonius, writing long after the supposed Roman destruction of the Druids, casually mentions men in Gaul who traced their ancestry to the Druidic tradition and served at native sanctuaries without apparent embarrassment or legal consequence. That casual mention tells us something important. Endings in genetic history and in cultural history are rarely as final as they appear. The institution was suppressed. The people were not. The tradition went underground, fragmented, retreated to the margins, but continued in the places where Roman authority was thinnest and the old roots held deepest. Every person alive today who carries Atlantic Celtic ancestry, Western Irish, Highland Scottish, Welsh, Breton, carries within their DNA a measurable connection to the Iron Age world the Druids inhabited. That connection is not symbolic, it is genetic. It is real in the most literal sense possible. The people did not vanish. The knowledge did not entirely vanish. It passed, as such things always pass, through families, through oral tradition, through the quiet persistence of practice and memory in places where the empire's reach was weakest. So who were the Celtic Druids, really? They were not the white-robed noble philosophers of romantic imagination, wise and serene above the politics of their world. They were not the savage human-sacrificing monsters of Roman propaganda, though violence in ritual contexts clearly occurred at some sites and in some periods, as the archaeology honestly confirms. They were not the timeless guardians of a pure and ancient indigenous tradition, because the people they emerged from were themselves the product of migrations that had completely remade the genetic landscape of Europe multiple times in the centuries before the first Iron Age grove was ever declared sacred. They were something more interesting and considerably stranger than any of those versions. They were specialists, possibly including women in numbers and roles far greater than the Roman sources ever acknowledged, operating across a population that was genetically diverse, regionally varied, and connected by culture rather than blood. They were the carriers of an intellectual tradition with roots stretching back thousands of years to the steppes of Eastern Europe, brought west through the migrations that shaped Celtic ancestry, inherited and refined and adapted across centuries of transmission without writing. They were the keepers of astronomical knowledge, of legal frameworks, of oral memory sophisticated enough to require 2 decades to transmit, embedded in a social world where, as we now know from the bones and the DNA themselves, women occupied positions of wealth, power, and almost certainly ritual authority that Roman writers found so alien they struggled to describe it without defaulting to condescension. The ancient DNA research of the last 2 decades, and especially the breakthrough study published in Nature in January 2025, has not solved the Druid mystery. It has done something more valuable. It has given us the real people underneath the myth, the Bell-Beaker descendants, the Atlantic fringe populations, the Iron Age communities organized around female lines of descent, burying their highest status members with mirrors and chariots and gold, maintaining genetic continuity across centuries that no empire ever quite managed to fully interrupt. Those people's genetic signatures pulse through modern Irish, Scottish, Welsh, and Breton populations today. They are not gone. They were never gone. The institution the Romans destroyed was real. The people the institution belonged to were always larger, always more complex, always more deeply rooted than any army or any law could reach. The Druids may never be fully recovered from history. Too much was lost in the groves the Romans burned, in the memories that were never written down, in the generations of transmission that eventually thinned and faded without the structure to sustain them. But the world they inhabited, the genetic world, the social world, the world where a woman buried with a mirror and a chariot amulet lay at the center of her community's power and her community's memory, that world is recoverable. It is being recovered one ancient genome at a time in laboratories where the DNA of the long dead finally gets to tell its own story without Caesar's pen in the way. And that story, the real one, is more remarkable than any myth, because it is true. Consider for a moment what it means that the single most important fresh discovery about Iron Age Celtic society, published in one of the most respected scientific journals in the world in 2025, is not about Druids at all in the way the myth frames them. It is about women, about a society so structured around female lines of descent, female inheritance, female authority, that the Roman soldiers who encountered it were genuinely confused by what they were seeing. A society where the richest burials, the most elaborate grave goods, the most powerful ritual objects consistently belonged to women, not as a curiosity or an exception, but as the foundational pattern of how that world was organized. The Romans wrote about it because it disturbed them. Modern historians assume the Romans were exaggerating because female power disturbed them too, in different ways, through different assumptions. The bones said otherwise. The DNA said otherwise. And now the evidence is published, peer-reviewed, and available for anyone willing to sit with what it actually means for the story we tell about the ancient Celtic world and the priestly class who stood at its center. Think about what a Druid actually was in that world. Not in Caesar's world, not in the Romantic imagination, in the actual Iron Age Celtic world that the DNA now reveals. A specialist operating within a society where female authority was built into the structure of kinship itself, where women stayed in their home communities across generations, accumulating land, networks, memory, and social power across a lifetime that men who married into those communities never matched, where the objects associated with ritual and with the spirit world, the mirrors that Professor Melanie Giles calls potent and dangerous, were buried specifically with women as markers of a domain of authority that was theirs by the structure of their society. Does it change anything about the Druid story to know that the world the Druids presided over was built on female foundations in ways that Rome found so strange it barely knew how to describe them? It should. Because the Druids, whoever and whatever they were, did not float above their society in some timeless mystical space. They were embedded in it. They were products of it. And if the highest status members of that society were women, if the richest burials were women, if the community's genetic continuity ran through female lines for generations before the Romans ever arrived, then the assumption that the Druidic tradition was fundamentally and always a male institution deserves to be questioned far more seriously than it ever has been. Tacitus was not confused when he placed those black-clad women on the shores of Anglesey alongside the Druids. He was describing something real, something that made Roman soldiers, men trained to march into formations of armed warriors without flinching, momentarily freeze in uncertainty. That reaction was not to the Druids standing there, it was to the whole picture, a ritual landscape organized in ways that had no equivalent in Roman experience, drawing its authority from a structure of power that Rome did not recognize as legitimate because Rome had spent centuries making sure women could not hold it. The genetic record from the Atlantic fringe, from Western Ireland and Highland Scotland and coastal Brittany, shows communities that preserved this world's deep roots longer than anywhere else in Europe. Communities where Roman authority was weakest, where the old kinship structures had the most room to persist, where Celtic language survived continuously and Celtic oral tradition had the longest uninterrupted chain of transmission. These are the communities whose descendants today carry the most measurable genetic continuity with the Iron Age world the Druids inhabited, not as a romantic claim, as a measurable scientific fact visible in the data published by researchers across the last 2 decades. And that is where the story lands, not with an ending, with an inheritance. One that runs not through institutions or texts or monuments, since the Romans burned the groves and the tradition was never written down, but through the biological continuity of the people themselves. Through DNA passed from parent to child in Western Ireland and Highland Scotland and the Breton Peninsula for 2,000 years after the last organized Druidic ceremony was suppressed by imperial decree. The Druids are gone. The world they lived in is recoverable, one ancient genome at a time, and it is stranger, more complex, more fascinating, and more deeply rooted in the actual lives of actual people than the myth ever managed to be. That is always how the truth works. It is always better than the story we told in its place.